Welcome to the Cove Podcast, your stop for PME on the go.
Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, or afternoon for wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cove Podcast. I'm Captain Todd Lemper, and today's episode is going to be based on future warfare. My guest today joining us is Dr. Jack Watling, PhD, and he's the Senior Research Fellow for Land Warfare at the Royal United Services Institute, the world's oldest and the UK's leading defence security think tank. He works closely with the British military on the development of concepts of operations, assessments of the future operating environment, that's what we're going to touch on today, and conducts operational analysis of contemporary conflicts, which is incredibly exciting, and we'll talk through some stories. Jack has worked extensively on the conflicts in the Ukraine, Iraq, Yemen, Mali and Rwanda, amongst others, and today he's going to talk to us about future warfare. Welcome, Jack.
It's good to be with you.
So before we get into the book and the ideas inside your book and the research that you've done, I want to talk first about what brought you to this moment, and I think because it highlights a unique perspective that you have. Interestingly, you started life as a journalist, and I think in the book you talk about journalists and the Defence Forces avoiding journalists to some degree and being somewhat standoffish. You argue that it increases risk, but we'll talk about that later. But you started life as a journalist and you've never served in the military yourself. There's a quote in the book that says, "I'm not and have never been a soldier, but what I lack in expertise I hope to remedy by perspective." What gets you so interested in the future of warfare? And I suppose the army, because we're talking about land warfare.
So in 2015 I was in Mali, and there were a wide range of problems facing the country. There were a lot of NGOs. There was the UN trying to do development work, trying to provide education, and most of those programs were failing. And they were failing for one fundamental reason, which is that there was a lack of security. And in an environment where there is a lack of security, any progress you make in other areas can be wiped away in a day. And so it was a moment of realization that this is foundational and therefore is worth devoting time to understanding. And so most of my work from that point forwards was primarily on military subjects. And as the international security environment worsened and we transitioned from the primary threat being from non-state actors to being non-state actors enabled by states to being direct threat from state actors, my interest in terms of the threats to security also shifted towards great power competition, which is where we are now, and therefore the future of conventional operations. So it's been an evolution, and in some ways it's been reactive. Yeah,
okay, yeah. And you can see as you read your ideas inside the book and elsewhere that there's just a passion, an absolute passion for the topic and for land warfare as well. Talk about that unique perspective, I suppose, as an academic. What perspective do you bring that varies from sort of army members, I suppose?
So the Royal United Services Institute was founded in 1831, and for most of its history it's been a place where retired or senior officers go to think about and reflect on their careers and also the future, uninhibited by the constraints imposed by the chain of command and the need to stick to certain lines about what the future looks like. It's since become an independent research institute, and so it employs both military and academic personnel. And if you're going to provide challenge, and if you're going to be a value add to the military, it's a bit limiting if all of your staff have been through exactly the same education process, have been on the same operations, already know everyone in the institution. You need some people who have that expertise, but actually you want colleagues who are not approaching it from exactly the same priors. You want people to ask the dumb questions, right? Because sometimes a professional body can essentially get itself into a rut where everyone's come at it from exactly the same starting point, and therefore they've worked themselves into a difficult problem. And when you're stood back, you can actually assess differently. To give you an example, when I was in Iraq, I was actually engaging mostly with the PMF, the Hashd al-Shabi, the Shia militias. And there were policy reasons why US, UK, coalition officers were not allowed to meet with them. But they actually provided a very substantial part of the Iraqi security forces. Whereas I could engage them all the time, speaking to their commanders, traveling around with them, etc. And so there were theories about what was driving this institution that the military had that were founded upon a lack of access and a lack of perspective. And so if you could provide that perspective because you had different permissions, then that is a useful thing to bring to the table, right? And I think the question now, given that I mainly work with the military, is very much how can I make independent research useful to practitioners? It's about utility to them and service to them, right? Rather than just trying to spark interesting conversations. It's very much about how do we support? Yeah.
Yep. And I think it would take a mountain of work to sort of work out how that utility or how information can be useful. I think you talked in your book a number of times about being maybe in observation posts with Joint Fires Team commanders or being in the back of armoured vehicles and stuff with the crew inside. When we have a little bit, I suppose there's a little bit of standoff with someone who's not exactly the same as us in terms of wearing a uniform or whatever, and we're like, what's going on? And, you could be under investigation or whatever like that. How do you bridge the gap with like soldiers and junior officers? And you talked about briefing 2 stars and then going down to an observation post. Like, how do you make the transition to really like get at the soldiers and like find out what is actually happening? Because it comes through in the structure and the second part of your book, and we'll talk more about it. But how do you bridge that gap, I suppose?
I think the first thing is you need to understand who you're talking to, what they're responsible for, what perspective they have, and how busy they are. So, for example, if you walk into a headquarters and they're at the beginning of the orders process and you go and start annoying the J2 and his staff or her staff, you're going to upset people because they are very busy, right? But as soon as the second question and the estimate's sorted, actually the pressure comes off them, then you can go and talk to them. And if you understand what their responsibility is and you can talk to them about the areas where they feel comfortable and they know where the boundaries are, then you automatically break down a lot of barriers. So know who you're talking to and when to engage and what to engage on. And then there's also that fundamental question, I think, when you show up in a unit, which is how much of a pain in the ass is this person going to be, right?
Yeah.
So, for example, when my colleague Nick and I went out to Project Convergence this year, we showed up in the middle of the night in the tent, and make sure you go in with red light, make sure you be quiet, make sure you get into where you're supposed to sleep. You set up your bivy bag properly. Your kit looks fairly clearly not military kit in terms of what it is, but there's an admin system and it's clearly orderly. And so when people wake up in the morning, you're unobtrusive. And they kind of look at it and go, okay, this person's not going to be a burden.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. So pick when you intervene with the right people, try not to get in the way.
Yeah. And is it interesting you talked about the guard dropping, I suppose, like, do you watch the guard drop as you go and like they, test a little bit more and it sort of goes lower and lower and lower and then eventually you're just talking and it's maybe too honest? Is that how it works?
Yeah, it takes time.
Yeah.
And when you get it right, as you say, people start talking to you as though you were in the unit or at least in the same organization. And sometimes they realize that maybe you can add value as well. The J2 suddenly starts asking you questions because you may have had access to things that they haven't. Yeah, exactly. And so that means that you are actually adding value to the unit rather than just detracting time.
Yeah.
And that's where it gets really positive. At the same time, very often you are there to do a job, which is different from the unit that you're observing. And so sometimes it doesn't work perfectly, right? And there's always that tension. Certainly, you get as you say, hesitancy among some soldiers, because especially if they've seen you engaging with senior officers, and there's that question about what are you going to go and say? Yeah. And that's totally valid. And then, of course, operational security concerns. If you're with a foreign military, that's always an issue as well. But most of that's just interpersonal skills and time.
Yeah. And I think all through, obviously we've spoken for a bit now, and all through your book, there's that level of passion there. I think that must come through as well in terms of like you're genuinely passionate about it. It's not just like you're going in to do a job. It seems like you're genuinely passionate about how things work, and you're really inquisitive. And it comes out in the, especially the structuring component of your book. The passion must really come through for the soldiers as well.
Hopefully, you'll have to ask that.
I think so. Yeah, it comes through for me anyway. Now we'll get to the book now. The book you wrote is called The Arms of the Future. It's on Kindle, and we'll sell it at the end as well because we really want people to read it. It's absolutely awesome. But I want to talk about writing the book. So obviously we talked about being an academic, having a bit more time and a think tank to think critically and outside of the chain of command, the demands of the chain of command. Maybe not the demands, but the constraints of the chain of command. Where did you, and I know the answer to this, so I'm priming you, but where did you write the book?
So I was supposed to be on sabbatical, the holy grail in academia, where you get a grant that means that you don't have to do your day job. And I was mapping out where I was going to go, who I was going to meet, which exercises I'd observe. And then instead, I found myself traveling to Ukraine. This is before the full-scale invasion. And initially, we were traveling there to look at, to gather data on armored engagements. However, it was close enough to when things were kicking off that we suddenly got a very different set of instructions. And we were retasked. And so we ended up staying in Ukraine until just before the invasion, came back, went back into Ukraine very shortly after the invasion. And I've been going back in every other month ever since, which somewhat disrupted my writing plan, to say the least, and also meant that we ended up producing a lot of other assessment work. However, it completely flipped what would have otherwise been quite a theoretical exercise into a very practical one, which also made it quite easy to write because I could write with much greater confidence, I suppose, about how certain systems work. And how they work in a fully contested EMS. All those questions that we'd debated for a long time on exercise about would this really play out that way? Suddenly we knew the answers. The downside was that you ended up drafting in, the back of cars and train garages and, in particular, managing MCOM, which meant I didn't have access to the internet for much of it. And so where the book is weak is in its acknowledgement and engagement with the academic literature, because there are plenty of colleagues writing about the future of war, and a lot of them are doing very good work, and I really enjoy engaging with them. But I just didn't have access to their books when I was writing it, which is a failing in terms of getting it out. But I have to apologise for that and move on.
Yeah, and I mean, you make explicit mention in your introduction in the book about sorry to all my academic colleagues, but I was in a war zone, so I couldn't include all of the journal articles that I wanted to. But I found that hilarious. But for us, it makes reading it makes it so much more. I think you toy with or the contemplation between is this actually revolutionary or does it make an incremental change and stuff like that. You're constantly to and froing about that. I sort of want to talk about that because I know a lot of people talk about Clausewitz and the difference between the nature of war and the character of war. You're constantly going between the two for the entire duration of the book. Can you just explain, I suppose, the difference and how it's relevant to your research?
I'm going to be slightly annoying and say that I think soldiers get really caught up on this question, and it's important in terms of the identity of soldiers, that they are taking risk and that they are putting themselves at risk on behalf of others, and that, the violent nature of conflict and the fact that they have a unlimited liability and what that means. And so I understand why the profession talks about nature and character obsessively. But to be honest, I think it's a little bit like theologians talking about dancing on the hen, how many angels on the head of a pin. It goes round and round and round, and we don't move. Whether war is revolutionary or rapidly evolutionary doesn't matter very much, I dare say. It's definitely changing.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. And we need to make sure that we accurately identify what is changing, how it's changing, and how to get ahead of our adversaries in that change. Yeah. So I don't want to dismiss that debate because I understand why soldiers care about it. But I also think, it's one of those areas where when soldiers want to talk to academics, they go towards that because academics obsess over definitions. And so it gets the academics excited. But it doesn't actually it's not practically very consequential, right?
Yep.
Like if this is 5 degrees faster change than we expected, and now it meets the definition for revolution rather than rapid evolution, it's like, yeah, okay, but you still got to update your equipment, your doctrine, your tactics, etc., in order to remain competitive, which means that from a practical point of view, it's the same problem.
Yeah, okay. And I suppose that change and talking about like keeping up with change is an interesting segue to sort of introduce the structure of the book. But I suppose it's in 3 parts. The first part being the changes or the future of warfare, I suppose, and the changes that are currently happening. And from your observations, and we'll draw out some anecdotes because the stories are absolutely awesome. And then subsequently it talks about your idea of the structure of how an army should fight in the land domain, and then link it back to the multi-domain operations at the end is the final part of. Have I murdered that, or is that pretty accurate?
No, I think that's accurate.
Okay,
it's like
good.
problem, solution, implications, right? You can put it that way. Or, the first is looking at what's changed. The second's looking at how we address those changes. And the third is looking at how the military fits into both other domains in the political context of, the use of the military instrument. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So with how war has changed, I suppose, starting with the first part, we talk about a significant amount of drones and an increase in the amount of drones and what drones can do and stuff. I've noted in the book sort of the ideas that communications are more important than anyone could ever imagine. So too are fires, significantly more important than what anyone could even imagine. And we can see a lot of investment in fires and an entire brigade in Australia as well. But what has sort of changed in the context of war currently and where it's going to go in the next? Because your sort of time frame you put on the book was out to sort of 2050.
Yeah, I think the changes that I outline in the book are going to be relevant out to 2035, 2040, because things that you program now are going to deliver and be in service until then. A lot of the platforms that I advocate would then be in service until 2050, but frankly, then you would also have additional things coming in, right? So I think things will look different in 2050. 2035, 2040, I think they will look similar to what's articulated in the book. In terms of the fundamental change, I would say warfare for the last 100 years has been characterized by walking into uncertainty. And how do you plan for significant levels of uncertainty? How do you maintain momentum in a context where you are having to rapidly ingest information as it reveals itself to you, and then battle against the frictions to press through? We're now in a situation where you can sit a long way from the fight, or you can sit in a company command post, and it doesn't make a huge amount of difference. And you can see or track every enemy vehicle continuously, pretty much. That is technically possible. It is difficult to have that as a continuous capability. It's also very difficult to use. Just ingesting and understanding and comprehending all of the information that's available is actually very difficult. And so there are all sorts of ways in which you can still be blindsided. But the reality is that a commander today can probably get the answer to any question they ask about what's in front of them. And that level of pervasive ISR, it's not just drones, it's space-based observation, it's detection capability in the electromagnetic spectrum. But even just to take UAVs as an example, in Ukraine today, there are around 1,000 to 1,500 UAV reconnaissance orbits over Ukrainian territory every day. That's not quadcopters. There's tens of thousands of those in the air. There's around 25 to 50 of those for every 10 kilometers of front, and there's 1,200 kilometers of front. That's medium altitude penetrating ISTAR assets, right? So there's between 1,000 and 1,500 of those penetrating Ukrainian airspace every day. It is very difficult to find an MSR or GLOC behind the Ukrainian position where there are not at least 5 UAVs watching it. And so that is the density of electro-optical observation in the close, in the deep, and it's continuous, which means that a lot of the considerations that have driven how soldiers organize and fight historically don't really apply. I'll give you one that definitely upsets infanteers. Infantry training, you take people out, you show them the ground, you teach them how to read ground. Where's the dead ground from the position they're trying to get to? Do you go left flanking up the center? Do you go right flanking? And usually, certainly in the British military, there's a classic conundrum that officer cadets are shown where the answer is the least pleasant, the grimmest option, right, which is going up this river in Brecon. The reality is today, all of those are the wrong answer because the enemy can see you, and the second you get out of cover, they can call in fires on you, and they will, unless you have a counter-reconnaissance solution. So your starting point is fundamentally different. And you can create the ambiguity, you can blind the enemy, you can use deception, you can degrade their ISR, you can slow down their kill chains, and then you can operate. But if you're not thinking about the problems in that sequence, then you're going to come unstuck.
I think the ISR piece, to rewind a touch to the ISR piece and overloading of information. You didn't say overloading, but it can at times feel incredibly overwhelming to have that many sensors and data coming in. I was the battle captain on Project Convergence 22, so we might have been over there at the same time. But I'll bring that up because we've got this is our third iteration, I think, that Australia's contributed to it, and it's getting larger and larger. It's an awesome experiment that the US Joint Force Modernisation Command run, and it's basically testing C2 in a box. It's absolutely awesome because you get a division. We had a cavalry division attached or in the box, and they basically defence industry just gets to run all of these industry innovations and experiments and all that sort of stuff onto them. But the main thing we went into a trying to get a COP or a common operating picture, and the amount of data that was on there just to be able to read it as a human being was overwhelming. Like there's layers on layers on layers and dots on dots and red dots, yellow dots, blue dots. Like there's so much information that's coming in. But I think you talk to machine learning and sort of to try to simplify that sort of process. How does that work in terms of actually getting to the core of, because I mean, you can have so many sensors, but inevitably you need the analysis behind it to be able to use the data. How does machine learning help with that?
So what you've highlighted is that there's a huge amount of data and most of it's irrelevant in terms of what you're looking for, right? And AI, machine learning, is pretty terrible when it comes to contextless judgments, or rather, it's not very good at making contextual judgments. It's not good at understanding context. But when you give it a clearly bounded task, it's very, very good at cutting through huge amounts of data to present what you have defined as relevant. And so let's just take acoustic signatures as a good example, or radar returns. Actually, I'll use radar. If you have a normal air defense radar, you will be told that it can track, say, 120 targets. And the reason why you're told it can track 120 targets is not the technical limitations of the radar. The radar can track loads of things. It's because if the screen starts being populated by more than around 120 targets, then the operator, as you say, is just lost in data, right? And then they're not able to track anything meaningfully. But what that means is that if you have a human operating a radar, then you need to bound the characteristics of what it is actually showing on the screen, and usually that's done with Doppler gates. So I'm looking for things that are moving at a certain speed, that have a certain size of RCS, radar cross-section, that correlates to a threat system like a missile or a radar, or an aircraft. Now that we have loads of UAVs in the airspace that you also need to track, you open the Doppler gate to slow-moving things that are not moving in linear trajectories and things that have small radar cross-sections, and you end up getting blooming from clouds, you end up getting birds showing up. And in fact, I was in Israel recently, and they were doing this to try and deal with UAVs coming in from Lebanon, and they ended up shooting down some seagulls, right? Because it looked the same on the radar screen.
What size caliber are we using to shoot down this? No, continue.
There's missile engagements.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, air defense missiles. That's expensive. Yeah.
Yep.
if you have machine learning algorithms, they are very, very good at being able to cross-cue to distinguish between what is a bird and what is a drone. And so, and I've seen these algorithms being used in real live situations, and you get very, very few false positives. You know, even across the entire Ukrainian battle space, so thousands of kilometers, you get, you know, a few false positives a day, maybe, in their C2 systems. And so one person, and I've sat down with said person, can sit there and manage the tracks for their whole air defense system. That person can't necessarily coordinate what you do about it.
Yeah.
Like, they would become saturated very quickly, but it is possible for them to look and understand. And that's essentially just processing so that what comes up on your screen is what you've defined. Now, there's a huge risk there because you can repurpose the algorithm and say, I want to look for something else, and it will start picking up other things. But if you don't do that, and the enemy works out what it is that you are tracking and what you're not tracking, then they can game that and they can deceive you. And then they will fly through and nothing will show up on your screen at all, even though your sensors can detect it. So that process of filtering the data, again, it's not that you can't detect things, it's that you have to make choices about what you look for. And if you're not actively thinking about that, and if you don't test your assumptions occasionally, then you can fall systematically, like you can fall for deception, basically. You become hyper vulnerable.
Yeah. I think that talk about the operator being able to decipher what is happening and then someone making a decision about what to do about it, I suppose. And sort of there's, I think there's an argument in the book where you're talking about that being brought rearwards and then being able to communicate that forwards from the C2 element somewhat further back than is the case in the past. That relies, this is sort of want to tease out, is that reliance on communications and being able to communicate that information forward to make decisions. But we talk about, when we talk about advancements in communications, we sort of argue that we currently train on the basis that we will be denied all communications and therefore should be able to fight without it. That's the basic premise, that we go into exercises banning people from having phones because we can give off a signature, and the communication we drop to high frequency comms because we don't want to use satellite communications. So we basically fight with our communications. It's not as simple, or I suppose you argue that it's not as simple as that for the enemy to completely deny communications. Do you think we overdo it, the emphasis on operating completely without communications, or is it well-founded?
So Russia has some of the most capable electronic warfare capabilities in the world, and they have failed to deny communications throughout the Ukrainian battle space. They have persistently introduced latency, uncertainty, complexity into moving data from where it is to where it needs to be. And electronic warfare is fundamental to competitiveness on the battlefield. But the environment is electronically extremely active. It's not denied. It's actually, from a physics point of view, extremely difficult to deny the EMS completely. Firstly, because that requires you to emit. And if you're emitting, you can be detected and struck. So a jammer's not going to be on pumping out wide area jamming the whole time. There is a reason why we train that way. We train that way, I would suggest, for there's two reasons. The first one is that because the actual effect of electronic warfare is not to deny communications, it is to introduce huge bands of uncertainty as to whether your messages got through and what they ended up being. They create serious safety issues. For example, if you're driving at night and you are navving off a GNSS system, so a satellite navigation system, and I don't deny you GNSS, I just move you 50 meters to the left, and I actually do that to you on exercise, there is a real risk that you will drive into, I don't know, a river. It's pretty difficult to see water when through night vision goggles, especially older ones. Run over some of your own infantry in a position. Those are real training risks. And because we struggle to use electronic warfare against our own troops in a way that is compatible with either security or with safety, we prefer to say, well, just turn your radios off and we'll pretend that you're being jammed, even though that's not what it's like at all. And then the other reason is that EW operators are extremely scarce commodity in the military. And so they're usually not present in a lot of training. And most maneuver officers do not have the expertise to accurately replicate EW effects on exercise and make reasonable training serials that reflect the challenge. That's a failing of our professional military education. And so between those two things, yeah, we create this very binary narrative, which is that, well, your comms are either on or off. The reality is, if you're not fighting to be able to communicate, both laterally within the force, in terms of sharing situational awareness, and vertically, then you are not going to be competitive against your enemy. Like, if you take the approach of, I'm not going to have comms, you will get your people killed. That's the consequence. And I'll give you a very straightforward, specific example of why. Let's say you have electronic protection supporting your force that is being applied from higher echelon to deny the enemy the ability to efficiently strike your unit with first-person view drones. It is invisible to you where that jamming ends. It's not a solid planning assumption, right? But a higher echelon can track you, and they can see where you are, and they can tell you when you're about to hit the edge of that protection. And so if you just crack on as a maneuver commander with no comms and you walk over that line, it will be invisible to you and all the blokes around you, but the level of attrition against your force will suddenly go through the roof. Whereas if you do have that link, you can be told to stop before it's too late. So no, we should be fighting for communication. We shouldn't be abandoning it.
Yep.
Having said that, there are periods where you may make a proactive choice to drop your AIMCOM signature and to take a posture which is, trying to minimize emissions, and that's a completely valid tactical choice. And so you need to be able to navigate without the support of GNSS. You need the skills. But that's a very different thing from the tactical presumption that you've been denied.
Yep.
Sorry, that was a very long, convoluted answer.
That was excellent. I suppose when you talk about, so obviously denying communications, binary, it's an argument that's often made binary, but it's not that simple, obviously. But in reference to spoofing, use the analogy of the golden retriever and a cookie to emphasise the importance of understanding cyber capability in peacetime and while we're practicing, I suppose. Can you just explain that analogy and how it works?
Sure. So, coming back to the point about AI being bad at judging context, right? If you see a cardboard box walking towards you, you're probably going to be quite suspicious about what's under the cardboard box that makes it move, right? Whereas a machine learning algorithm that has been taught to look for people will return the answer that is not a person, it is a cardboard box. And in fact, in one experiment where they were trying to test whether they could spoof a protection system that DARPA had set up with a camera, a Marine actually did just put a cardboard box over himself, run up to the camera and knock it over, right? And this, as far as the AI was concerned, no humans were involved. Okay. And you see the same thing when you try and train machine learning algorithms to distinguish between, say, dogs, cats, zebras, etc. Because what it will do is it will positively correlate characteristics that it associates with what it's been asked to look for. But if you then ask it to distinguish between, or rather don't ask it to distinguish, but rather just show it a cookie, which has the same color and roughly the same, black dots and so on, you will start getting a whole load of false returns. And you can train the algorithm to not make that mistake. But the point is you have to have had that data and fed it through it and given it a way of distinguishing. Otherwise, if it's been taught to distinguish between other things and a dog, but hasn't been shown all of the possible things that it could see, then you can present it with an image that it suddenly starts to positively identify as a dog, even though to a human it would be very obvious that that's not the case.
Okay, yeah. Awesome analogy, I think, to explain some of the limitations, I suppose. You talked about it would be remiss of me not to talk about fires, obviously. And how is fires changed, I suppose, in the Ukraine, using that as a concept, and I suppose Israel as well? How's fires changed?
So fires have been the most lethal thing on the battlefield for over a century. And we forget that most soldiers are wounded or killed by artillery. That's has been the case, and it's actually an increasing trend, not a diminishing trend. And that's simply because historically of the weight of high explosive, the lethality, and the impact on cover. A lot more things will protect you from a direct fire weapon than an indirect fire weapon. However, there are now technological changes that mean that the lethality of fires is increasing further. And to give you an example, if I was to call an artillery strike on your position in 2003, I would need to, as a reconnaissance team, calculate the grid reference for the target, communicate that back to a fire control headquarters who would talk to the battery. The battery would then need to execute, talk to me or talk to the fire control headquarters to confirm the mission and so on, deliver the effect. And then as the forward observer, I would need to correct fire and make sure that it was adjusted so that it landed on target. That's a lot of communications and a lot of people. Today, I can simply access through, let's say, satellite communication, although there are lots of ways of accessing it, a essentially shared map. I can drop a pin in the map. At that point, that is available to the artillery crew. They can then log into, let's say, a UAV feed, which there probably is a friendly one overhead. It doesn't need to be one that's under command of the battery, so that they have themselves direct eyes on target. They can calculate the fire solution, conduct the fire mission, and adjust their own fire. And the result is that the time for effect for a fire mission today from artillery is 2 minutes. And that's the real world battlefield timelines. With the ability to not only be quite precise about, because as soon as the artillery crew brings that UAV feed up, it's not just that they can endeavor to hit the point that you identified. It's also that they can start correcting for changes that may have occurred from when you dropped the pin. So let's say the enemy's moved 50 meters to the right. They can probably see it, and they can probably pre-adjust, right? So the responsiveness and accuracy of that fire is increasing. There are physical constraints on how far it can increase, notably the fact that the round still has to travel through the air. So, it can't get faster, really. But it can get more precise. And so what we're observing is that, and therefore contesting precision becomes critical, which again means that electronic warfare becomes a vital component for even a company level capability for self-protection.
Yeah, and not to jump topics again, but that speed at which you can enact a fire mission, the lethality of those rounds, and also the accuracy increasing, puts, I suppose, and you made the argument that logistics elements are at far more danger than has ever been the case before, and it's sort of pushing them back further and further from the front line, making them less responsive, I suppose.
So there's two risks to logistics, and I think we need to highlight both. The first one is that logistics units have to stockpile large quantities of stuff, obviously, and usually we put that in a brigade support area. In Ukraine today, the Russians are conducting tactical operation missile engagements with Iskanders, and the PLA would do the same thing with a range of capabilities they have, hundreds of kilometers in depth. And if you can get live ISR over that target, which you can, then there isn't really a place where logistics capability can be stockpiled and it be safe unless you disperse it, conceal it, and make it not just a hard target to find, but also an inefficient target to engage. And so that breaks up the main support area and thereby reduces the density of forces you can actually sustain because you need more space to disperse everything. The second challenge is what I would call last mile resupply, the ability to actually get the stuff to the units. And again, we've seen in Ukraine, and I think this is a consistent problem that's going to get worse, the fact that frontline units can make themselves pretty survivable. They can dig in, they can put overhead protection on their positions, and so long as they're sufficiently dispersed and they have enough positions in their defensive system, the enemy can't necessarily engage them efficiently with fires while they're in that protection, because you don't know which positions are occupied and which are not. However, they're going to run out of ammo, they're going to get tired, they're going to need food, and they're going to need to evacuate casualties. And if they're in contact and fixed, there's probably only 1 or 2 G-locks that get back from that position to where those supplies are going to come from. And the enemy will have persistent observation over those G-locks. And so we actually see that more casualties are often taken during unit rotations or out of contact than are taken on the fighting positions. And often it's a higher rate of lethality in terms of the injuries that are sustained, because you are then moving often in soft-skinned vehicles, often out of cover, and consequently you are a vulnerable target. So that means that in order to enable resupply and protect your logistics capability, you need electronic warfare, air defense, and counter-battery capability. And so the interesting thing there is that our militaries are structured around, combat support, combat service support, and there is in some ways a hierarchy implicit in that about who's supporting and who's supported. And actually what we find is that all arms are supporting or being supported depending on the context. And that needs to be a dynamic relationship about who's actually at risk and who's helping who.
Yeah. I think that's interesting, the who supports who and the structure, because the second part of your book talks to a different structure. We propose a different structure to definitely the one we use. I'm not sure if any militaries are doing exactly that, but you propose the maneuver system, the fires system, the assault system, and then the support system as well. Can you just go through what structure you propose? And I think that's the best thing about the book, is that it gives tangible, you're down to the soldier level, exactly what you need in each fire team. And again, it's just hypothesizing what should be the case, but it's an awesome part to read, that it's actually tangible and meaty. And for us, it's absolutely awesome. But can you just explain the structure that you sort of...
Yeah, I mean, I have to preface it by saying that I do lay it out down to the fire team level and individual vehicles. And the reason I do that is not because I think that you have to follow the blueprint that I set out, but rather because when people are thinking about force design, they do need to think about how much equipment you're actually loading an individual with, what the cognitive load of an operator is, and therefore how many people you need in a unit to be able to carry out a task. And far too often you hear quite, senior force planners looking at their recruitment figures and thinking that technology will reduce the number of people that they can have in units with the same output. And my experience and observation is that that's usually not true. So there was kind of a reality check element as to why I went about it that way. But in terms of the logic of what I proposed, the reason why there are 4 very distinct systems is that each of those functions has very different tasks, is operating across a different area, has a substantially different zone of interest, and therefore has quite distinct command and control requirements and capability requirements. So the logic of the maneuver system is that you need to be able to carve out part of the battlefield where you have fire superiority, and you need to be able to remove the risk from your logistic elements so that you can concentrate force in order to take key objectives. That requires you to shape over quite a wide area. And it also requires you to operate and contest areas where the enemy has significant sensor saturation. And that means you need to be operating in a dispersed posture. You need to be quite light. You need to be mobile. And you need to have a C2 structure, which allows you to laterally integrate indirect effects, because you're probably going to be mutually supporting, but from beyond line of sight. What prevents the enemy from taking a heavy force and just driving straight through the middle of that dispersed, quite light force is your fire system. Because what your fire system combined with its organic reconnaissance provides is the shaping effect on the enemy that means that they are fighting against the same constraints. Therefore, they have to disperse. And if you don't have that fire system, or if it's attrited, then the enemy can simply concentrate and they will punch through your screen. And so the critical thing for, if lateral integration of the force is the thing that enables the maneuver system to function, vertical integration of the force between reconnaissance and fires is what enables the fires force to function. So it's a very different C2 structure, and therefore a separate function. The assault system, the premise is that land warfare is about key terrain on land. We like to say that you can maneuver around things. You can to a certain extent. You can definitely shape conditions, but ultimately in every war, you're going to have to get stuck in close combat. And the capabilities you need to do that are very different to what you need to do effective dispersed reconnaissance. It's going to be concentrated. You need to maximize firepower at every echelon. But that unit's probably not going to have huge amounts of endurance, and if it's exposed to a fires force, it will be broken up very quickly. And so it's a capability that you commit, and it's the decisive action, essentially. And the other elements of the force are shaping to enable that to take the key terrain. And then behind that, you need a logistics system, which is covering a very large area. That is needing to integrate with the civilian population. It's needing to deconflict. It's needing to manage taking in supplies into theatre or into the battle space. And therefore, it can't disperse for protection a lot of the time because it needs to deal with things like railheads or ports or bridges or pieces of infrastructure that enable tempo to be maintained. And so it needs to be able to protect those things. And it needs to manage rear area security. And so because it has a very different set of tasks, again, I would take it out from the other systems. And then you need a function to be able to integrate those so that they work as a force rather than as discrete components.
In that structure, and to bring it back to your analysis, being in Australia for some time, I know you've been jet setting all over the world for the last couple of months, so you probably haven't had time to think about it, but obviously we're starting to get a primary or a littoral brigade in Darwin, as in the 1st Brigade, that's starting to do the primary research and development with littoral concepts, with MurphD up there as well. We've got a fires brigade down in Adelaide, a heavier, much heavier, still littoral, but much heavier brigade up and 3 Brigade in Townsville, and then 7 Brigade, far more mobile. How, to bring that structure to Australia, how does it work in terms of our current context?
Okay, sure. So let's say you need to contest a set of islands to the north of Australia as a theoretical planning assumption. If I were to take your armoured forces and put them on a ro-ro and endeavour to send them north, I think it would be, I would assess with fairly high confidence that ro-ro will have an unfortunate interaction with an anti-ship missile and will probably sink. Unless you are able to establish a lodgement in that area, to conduct extensive reconnaissance, to understand what enemy ISR might be observing the approaches, to establish fire control over the sea lanes of communication that would allow an adversary surface combatant to get into a position to ambush those heavier forces. And so you would need to send in dispersed so that they can't all be interdicted, those reconnaissance capabilities. You would need to actively conduct counter-reconnaissance to roll back the enemy's ability to provide target tracks into the movement corridor. And you would need to start pushing forward fires capabilities that allow those maneuver forces to avoid just being driven into the sea, right, through counterattack by heavier enemy forces. Now, if you were to do that on a relatively large island, the enemy wouldn't be moved off the island by virtue of the fact that you had presence. They would be skirmishing. They wouldn't want to commit their force in a concentrated way necessarily, but if you had fires supporting, long-range fires supporting that unit, but they would probably hold key terrain. And if you were going to project beyond the island, then you would need to break into that key terrain and force them off it. And then most of the equation is flipped onto them, where you are projecting fires and reconnaissance and sensors to the north of that island, and they have to retreat to the next island, and so on. For that, you're going to need some assault forces. And so once you've created the conditions to be able to do a transit with heavier equipment, using lighter troops and fires, then that becomes possible. And so you have to then do that protected movement. But it becomes a sequence. And there's nothing particularly revolutionary about that, but it's simply the fact, I think, that Australia has shifted from a primary planning assumption, which was territorial defence of the main island, to one which is, in some extent, expeditionary. And therefore, you now are trying to work against a different series of problems in order to achieve the operational outcome that you want.
With the littoral concept and getting there in the first place, I suppose, to really simplify it, you talk about contested littoral in the book and how difficult it can be, or unviable, I suppose, in a sense. How early do you have to conduct the operations for it to be viable, I suppose?
So, yeah, I mean, the book doesn't deal with naval or littoral operations. It is an assessment of land warfare, essentially at the divisional level and below. But I've written elsewhere about littoral operations, and I've worked with the Royal Marines on their future commando force concept and so on. And the lessons that we have identified in that space, some are quite clear, which is that it's much easier to be there first. Fundamentally, if you've done the first movement with light troops before the war starts, then you buy out a huge amount of risk. Pre-positioning is extremely valuable. Actually having partnered forces can enable you to have that pre-positioning effect without necessarily having a permanent deployed presence, which may be both politically more sustainable and also more effective from a force posture point of view. So that's why joint exercising and that kind of stuff is, I think, really important. If you have to do a contested ship-to-shore movement, then I'm going to be pretty blunt and say we don't know how to do it, and you don't either, right? What we've seen is that we had a concept of how to do this, which, to be honest, hadn't evolved massively from the Second World War, and it used to work. There are fundamental threats to the capital ships that historically have enabled that kind of operation that mean that they are now pushed so far offshore that they are not able to operate in the way that they used to, and the landing craft we used to use are not really suitable. And what we've seen navies look at this problem and set and kind of think is, well, we can still achieve most of our operational and strategic objectives in terms of denial of sea lanes of communication and blockade, which is, from a naval point of view, key tasks, without entering that littoral space. So we're going to prioritize ensuring the survivability of our surface combatants and other capabilities. And in that sense, conceptually, I think navies have run away from the problem by basically saying it's not our problem. Land forces don't have the expertise because they're land forces. Marines have been left trying to bridge a widening chasm, which is a very uncomfortable position to be in. And so I don't think it's the case that there isn't necessarily a way of doing that kind of operation. It's not that it's not possible. It's just that for the last 30 years, it hasn't been a priority and no one's really looked at it. And for the last 10 years, where it's been becoming increasingly difficult, those responsible for looking at it have prioritized elsewhere. Now, what that means for the Australian military, to my mind, is that you have a hugely valuable opportunity, which is to experiment and learn and refine your doctrine, and build up an understanding of how you can do that kind of operation, because the need to be able to do it is very evident. I would need to do more research before I proposed the solution, but it's a problem that we're all grappling with, and I think the Australian military has been forward-thinking in not basically saying it's someone else's problem, and that's what a lot of countries are doing. So there's this gap that needs to be filled, and I'm very glad that a force that's as competent and capable as the Australian Army is trying to grapple with it.
In your observations and talking about a unique perspective coming in and sort of assessing the institution or the organisation that is the Australian Army, what do we do really well?
So I haven't been on exercise with the Australian Army, and I haven't been out in the field. It's an opportunity. Yeah. I'd love to come out to Taliban Sabre next year and observe and so on. What I have observed are Australian staff officers and commanding officers who are in US units for the most part and elsewhere. And I know that they are extremely valued by their colleagues in the US and in the UK when they are plugged into British units because of the quality of their training and their expertise. They often come in with a slightly different perspective. So, I remember being with a plans officer who was Australian in a British battle group, and British officers were doing their thing, and he was getting quite obsessive about battlefield geometry. And everyone was looking slightly confused.
That being control measures and cutting out pieces of land and stuff, I suppose.
Yeah. And movement, like how you orchestrated movement so that you didn't end up with, But actually what he was raising were pretty valuable insights into how the plan that was coming together would unfold in a dynamic environment. Just the relationship between movement, rates of movement, and terrain. And the plan was drastically better for his input. So where I have seen Australian, primarily officers, I have to say, that's not a slight on your enlisted personnel. It's just I've not seen them operate. But it has been that the level of professionalism has been extremely high and very valued. So I look forward to seeing what that translates into when it's an Australian unit that's
getting in the back of a PMV on Talisman Sabre, or like in an OP with the Joint Flyers team. Good to go. See some soldiers absolutely doing exactly the same thing. So
the one I'm really interested in, by the way, is if anyone's to show me this, is how you plan on changing your tyres on Boxer. Not in terms of an individual Boxer where one has been blown and you need to replace it, but as a formation when you do a long road movement and then you need to transition to off-road tyres across a unit, how you safely disperse the force, get the tyres from the logs chain to where they need to be and do that quickly so that you're not just sat relatively close to the combat area in a big lager for a long period of time. Like I'd love to see how the Australian Army executes that, because you're dealing with an adversary that has significant ISR and significant long-range strike capability. So it's a problem that we need to work out in the British Army, and I'd be very interested to see how you're going about it.
That's a challenge. I suppose you said a challenge to the 2nd 14th Regiment anyway. But that's an interesting part that I want to go down is you've got the Australian Army now. You can grab them by the shoulders and tell them this is what you really need to concentrate on, or this is more serious than you think it is, or this is where your main effort should be. What are you telling the soldiers of the Australian Army, soldiers and officers?
I think the first thing is we need to grapple with the level of dispersion that's required and how that changes the tempo that you can operate at and the C2 frictions that emerge. I think there is a requirement to really get to grips with not just UAS, but counter reconnaissance and EW and the integration of that in tactical echelons as not a nice to have, but as fundamental to your survivability. That's not something where the Australian Army is behind. It's an area where most professional Western militaries are behind. I don't know how strong your air defense capability is, but air defense is very, very complicated in an environment where you are putting a lot of things in the air from tactical echelons, and so how you're managing friendly fire, deconfliction, battle space management for air defense is something that I'd be very interested in, and I think is a key priority. And then the other one is how you're thinking about being in contact continuously throughout your operational depth and what that means in terms of your sustainment footprint, how you are looking at the survivability of your logistics personnel, but also your medical capability, and where you actually place role 1, role 2, etc. So those are kind of key areas that I would focus on. I would say comms, but to be honest, everyone's obsessed about comms because they know what the opportunity is. So I think people are getting after that.
All right, that's been absolutely awesome. And to bring it back to our context, to take some lessons away, I suppose, is awesome. Your book is called The Arms of the Future, Technology in Close Combat in the 21st Century. It's an absolutely awesome read and gives some really meaty stuff, like I said, particularly in the structure component where you go down to the individual level, or fire team level, and really emphasises how many people it takes to achieve these effects. If anyone wants any more, where can they get more?
Well, they can go to the RUSI website, where we publish on a semi-frequent basis operational analysis from Ukraine, from other theatres. We just did a study on urban operations in Gaza by the IDF, and where we also publish quite a lot of more theoretical work. And then otherwise, I benefit hugely from soldiers reaching out and telling me why I've been an idiot and why I've got things wrong. So if people want to have a chat, then my details are online. If I'm not the right person to speak to, then I'll very happily direct you to colleagues who are working in adjacent areas. And yeah, hopefully this is a conversation rather than just RUSI on send.
Dr. Jack Watling, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Cove Podcast. Explore our channel for more great audio PME content. Also, visit us at cove.army.gov.au for hundreds of additional resources. The Cove, the learning home of the Australian profession of arms.